Hello, so we will be continuing in this video our study of Ethics of the Real by Alenka Zupancic. In the prior video in this series, I took up the foreword to the text, and I might have called it the introduction somewhere. Just to clarify, that was the foreword written by Zizek. What we will be taking up in this video is the introduction to the same book written by Alenka Zupancic. Now, without any further introductions, let me get to it. A reading of the subject in Alenka Zupancic's Ethics of the Real, Part 2, Introduction. I should begin by apologizing for the misnomer in the title presented by me in the prior video. That was actually on the foreword to the text, which was written by Zizek. The introduction is what we shall engage with now, and this is by the author herself. In reiterating the central orientation of the project, which is characteristic of the Lubana school, as presented earlier, that is, in a commitment to grasp the ethical as a domain which has been stitched in modernity by Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, in the psychoanalytic effort to locate a discourse not merely in what it explicitly states, but to substantialize the often obscene and unwritten background of mores whose discrete articulations often reveal an explicit distance from what the institution or doctrine may officially stand for. Alenka Zupancic points out the common focus of this psychoanalytic intervention into the heart of the ethical, marked by the name Immanuel Kant. Why do we require an orthodox, that is to say, a deontological philosopher, one who thinks of a priori commitments, prerequisite categories such as time and space, in presenting a critique of a sensorially saturated empiricism? To understand something as situated as ethics and as bodily as psychoanalysis. This seems to be a question which a curious mind would raise, and Alenka does help us out here. Just to reread the sentence in case it was unclear. Why do we require an orthodox, that is, a deontological philosopher, who thinks of a priori commitments, prerequisite categories such as time and space, in presenting a critique of a sensorially saturated empiricism, to understand something as situated as ethics and as bodily as psychoanalysis? This seems to be a question which a curious mind would raise, and Alenka does help us out here. In the essay Kant with Sade by Lacan, in his compulsion to frame a categorical imperative, that is, principles which may be followed irrespective of circumstance, the author cannot but notice a certain will to perversion, as it were, by Kant, or, to use more psychoanalytic terms, a manifestation of the drive which is beyond the pleasure principle proper. We sought to unpack something of the conceptual antagonism which this may entail in a discipline of thought in the earlier video, taking up the example of the law of diminishing marginal utility. The question at some level is, what is a law of thought? But here, perhaps better framed as what can we posit thought seeking a commitment to. Lacan himself sees in jouissance a psychic mechanism which can rival the will. And perhaps it is not mere circumstance that Sade's Philosophy in the Bedroom was written just 8 years after the Critique of Practical Reason. Those being two works by Sade and the second one by Kant. In this sense, I think it is important to notice what may be constitutive of the antinomy noticed by Lacan between these two. Yet, what he marks in this antinomy, which in their own time were not in dialogue, is a certain ethic, one he claims psychoanalysis may learn from. I was never fond of the idea of the autonomy of a movement, discourse, or even a people. This is not to say that I do not recognize the value of independence. The matter is simply about how may we represent an ethic which intervenes, indeed engages predominant mores of their common time and historical moment, that animate what was thought to be possible, indeed what was thought to be thinkable, then and in some cases even now. Remember that there is no jouissance possible without a structure which can represent the drive. The psychoanalytic name for this structure is fantasy. Let me repeat this section because I think it would be important for us. Remember that there is no jouissance possible without a structure which can represent the drive. The psychoanalytic name for this structure is fantasy. It is here in this presence that we may bear witness to and perhaps nourish an ethic. Yet perhaps the more immediate question is, why would one need an ethics? The cynicism of today would reduce any ethics to an execution of an order, in this sense an act of obedience. Yet if what was once recognized to be ethical in an act was the labor of bringing into the world perhaps an unsaturated insight at the very least, more importantly, something which we may find in ourselves a calling to, or in other words, that which may not, or rather that which is not present, then this would be the most debased understanding of the term, a fall of creation as it were to the merely given. The introduction by the author makes this observation regarding the ethical often being reduced to the superego in the discourse which seems to have characterized our time. As a kind of regulatory injunction, perhaps not unlike the figure of the managerial boss who oversees and directs proceedings in an office or a factory. Indeed, there may be an ethics of following orders in a workmanlike manner, yet the ability to abnegate our independent faculties, to be subsumed and instrumentalized, is not exactly an act on our part. And while it may well be possible to think of a workshop as the subject of a study, philosophy and yes, psychoanalysis has still not cast away the concept of an individual. This is a problem which we will return to later, perhaps under the rubric of subsumption, which is perhaps more or rather most explicitly apparent in the subsumption of the working day, about which Marx makes some rather clear observations. Without lending ourselves to distractions from this project proper, we should remember that psychoanalysis isn't perhaps an elementary definition, may be thought of as a study of a discourse in how it recognizes, appeals, and hence help construct, or to use a more Derridian term, welcome the other. In this sense, it is a mode of study which is uniquely advantaged in studying pairs. In recognizing the perverse moment or drive in Kant, as it were, Lacan also sees in his compatriot, Sade, an ethical drive willing to brush against, or rather willing to brush history against the grain. And I think it's important to grasp well this kind of antinomy that Kant is pointing out about the deontological philosopher Kant talking about a priori commitments and how there may be a certain kind of will to perversion at the heart of this, which may prompt a certain impetus to formulate terms in these ways, so to speak. Um, and of course, you may want to situate the history, or rather the reception of his work, in, or rather as a response to what he himself seeks to posit a rejoinder to, such as Berkeley and Hume. The fact that it is in Kant that we witness a critique of British empiricism is something that requires some sort of immanent understanding of Kant as a philosopher. And I think this is something that Lacan is trying to unpack and unravel for us. And also in Sade, the celebration of hedonism or perversion, or as which seem to be predominant subjects in philosophy in the bedroom, that requires a certain kind of ethical imperative to seek to present this as explicitly in these terms in a rather in the onset of what might be the dawn of modernity in Germany. I'm not very familiar with history at that point, but I think you get the kind of argument he's trying to make here. I don't want to belabor this point because I'm not as well informed as I would like to be. That which is real to us is perhaps the most commonplace way in which the Lacanian concept of the real may be introduced. Yet the Lacanian real is not merely that which is most real to us, like war, to use a visceral example. The idea of what is real is best framed as that which resists symbolization, or that aspect towards which our desire seeks some sort of discursive enunciation of. And here it is important to recognize that we are indeed very much in the politics of language. Misrepresenting a subject is often what is most injurious to them. Why? Because it denies the dimension of what was ethical to the subject, their axis of the real, as it were. This may not simply be a question of permitting a subject to choose the terms of their own representation, a practice which psychoanalysis would in any case encourage. The practice of an analytic discourse is a careful registering of the terms deployed by a subject, their observations, and from this a raising of what seems to be the difficulty which the desire of the subject seems to be wrestling with. Let me repeat this sentence. The practice of an analytic discourse is a careful registering of the terms deployed by a subject, their observations, and from this a raising of what seems to be the difficulty which the desire of the subject seems to be wrestling with. The politics of language, which I mentioned, does not rest merely in its act of fidelity to the desire of the subject, but in its subversion of doxa entrenched today high and low. Ethics, were it to acknowledge this dimension, that of the Lacanian real, in itself, cannot be thought of as a regulatory principle which brindles the excesses of a procedure, scientific, political, etc. It is a dimension, indeed, if not a drive, that must acknowledge this excess as precisely that which constitutes the conduct of science in the first place, as the impetus to the procedure, experiment, or creation in question. Let me repeat this because I think this is a little dense. The politics of language which I mentioned does not rest merely in its act of fidelity to the desire of the subject, but in its subversion of doxa entrenched today high and low. Ethics, were it to acknowledge this dimension, that of the Lacanian real in itself, cannot be thought of as a regulatory principle which brindles the excesses of a procedure, scientific, political, etc. It is a dimension, indeed, if not a drive, that must acknowledge this excess as precisely that which constitutes the conduct of science in the first place, as the impetus to the procedure, experiment, or creation in question. Ethics here, to place it within psychoanalytic theory, is that which suspends our understanding of the terms of the reality principle via a radical injunction, or, as the author puts it, a disturbing interruption into it. Psychoanalysis as a discipline, since at least Lacan, is said to be one which is resistant to the discourse of the master. That is, a discourse without remainder, where what is enunciated is deemed adequate, commanding, or constitutive of the subject in its entirety. In other words, a silent maxim we harbor is the impossibility of a discourse where the other is not merely another perspective, position, or person, but also another symbolic order, or logic, if you prefer. An ethic appears to be framed by the author in her act of resistance to the many-headed discourses of the master, seductive as they are to both traditionalists and extremists. Yet equally abhorrent is the postmodern reduction of the ethical horizon merely to one's own life. And I think you can see how this would be incommensurable with our endeavor as psychoanalysts. And I think if you were to recall the example in the foreword to that movie which is cited, Welcome to Sarajevo, about the final act of the mother relinquishing her maternal link with her daughter in witnessing her happiness in an English setting, is perhaps in some ways also speaks to this kind of resistance which Professor Zupancic may be trying to come to terms with. Now I will keep this particular video short because this passage was short. It was literally the introduction to the text. But I still felt that it was worth engaging with, worth explicating and presenting here, because it does frame the coordinates which this text will engage with, and what perhaps motivates the author herself in her effort to such a presentation. Now in the next video, and I don't want to go over this one very much because I think I've been able to frame what I wanted to with it, we will take up chapter 1, the moral pathology of everyday life. And that is all for today. Thank you for your time. I hope you have been able to garner something from what it is that I've sought to present here. And of course, as always, I welcome your criticism, any observations as well. And if you were to leave any comments in the section below, that would be good. And if you appreciate what I try and do here, if you can leave a like, subscribe to my channel, that would help immensely. Thank you again. Bye bye.